Okay. Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. We have a special guest. Oh, there's Mommy. There's Eliana. See yourself? Look at that. She needs a little bit more height there. But that's part of the reason, only part of the reason that we're doing these as recorded instead of live. The high speed out here is a little different. But I really think that this special guest is worth the change. And so you got to meet my granddaughter, Eliana. And really, this was our first opportunity to get to know her too. And she's doing a wonderful job. But I'm not going to have her here during the whole broadcast. So I'm going to give her back to Mommy. And she got to see Grandpa's weird headset and everything else. And we're going to get started this evening. But you know, we're kind of a different kind of station. We're community. And so I felt perfectly comfortable showing the family to you. We're going to get started now. There's some announcements that I want to make. And even though I'm not doing this live, and I do miss having you guys live, I do want to make these announcements. I threw it up here. We're doing some incredible work on the website. So I'm not just visiting my grandfather and doing some preaching and teaching, but we've actually been working on the website and the Patreon account. And I'm sure some of my wonderful moderators will throw up that Patreon account. I want to let you know that this is a really good time to visit the Patreon account because we're adding content to the different tiers. And in the future, we'll be adding different tiers. So if you've seen the Patreon account, you haven't seen it now. And so I'd encourage you to go there, look things over. Those are the folks that make these broadcasts possible. They're not the only folks, though. And I want to be clear on that. We are also connected with Chosen People Ministries, and so that is another way to support us. And I'm deeply grateful for our Chosen People folks who are also part of our online community, like my dear brother Steve. So there are two ways to go ahead and do this, but I do want to encourage you. Some folks just want to give to the videos and want to build the ministry that way. Some folks want to go ahead and contribute to us through Chosen People, and God is not offended by either. So check out that website and join us. I've also been able to make StreamYard show both monitors when I'm recording this. So it is not quite the same as being live, but it is still a lot closer. And my son teases me because there was a day I did not want to work with two monitors, and now I don't want to be without two monitors. So Grandpa is getting a lot more tech savvy as he goes on in this ministry. Let's get that second monitor up, camera with second monitor. I'm really excited about this show. The Esther show, I improved the outline and everything after I had uploaded it. And so that was a little bit of live and learn because I'm doing that as a sermon. So if you guys are interested, leave in the comments. I will actually upload the sermon to you guys. It's a Zoom, so I probably can get an MP4. And you could do Book of Esther and Deus Abscondus Part 2. But if it's too much repetition, then I'm good with that. You are the folks that get the say. Especially the regulars that tune in. So let me know. And we can do it. We can do it again with popcorn. We can do it again live. Save your questions. That's tonight. Tomorrow night, I am excited because this is continuing in Matthew through Jewish eyes. And we're going to have a wonderful discussion around some of the background here, which you may or may not be very familiar with. And hopefully I'm going to connect some of the dots in a new way. So let's get ourselves started by me getting the PowerPoint going. I want to make sure. There we go. The verse is up there. We are only looking at one verse. You'd say, what are you doing? Well, this is getting really exegetical. This is going to look at the background of that one verse, and then we'll get to the transition verse. It's actually two verses, and we'll get to a transition verse, but we won't go too far with it because I want to concentrate a little more on giving you more around these verses and a little less on trying to get as far as we can. And that's something that people who preach or teach face all the time. The amount of distance you make in the text versus the amount of depth. You know, you can go wide or you can go deep, and you have to decide which way to go. I'm kind of a deep guy, and so I'm excited to go a little deeper tonight. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees again. He's going to move into really laying on the judgment that's going to come on Jerusalem. Understand that he is walking, he is moving in the office of prophet. He is doing what a prophet does. Now, here's what a prophet doesn't do in the Old Testament. They don't tell you what color socks to put on. They don't tell you who you're going to marry. They don't tell you what your kid's first name is going to be. There is so much junk around prophecy right now. Prophecy sought to warn and encourage, and it was centered around covenant. So I'm very concerned about some of these modern prophetic movements and the new apostolic reformation and some of these things that take prophecy out of a realm. Now, Jesus is talking to Israel as Israel's rightful king and also as Messiah who would function as a prophet according to Deuteronomy 18 through 20. And he is warning them of the judgment to come. And he begins by really taking on the Pharisees. You notice he doesn't spend a lot of time with the Sadducees or the Essenes. He spends more time with the Pharisees because of how dangerously close they are to being right while being wrong. Okay, the most dangerous deception is the one that has an element of truth to it. And so he spends a good deal of time going ahead with the Pharisees because their doctrine is pretty good, but their practice is horrible. And so they represent a real danger, and they had greater popularity with the people than the Sadducees and the Essenes. And so he spent a good deal of time with them. He has, we've talked about some of the other woes. He now goes ahead and challenges them with blind Pharisees. Wait a minute now. Jesus is just this loving, easygoing guy that never has a problem with anyone, right? That's the picture of Jesus that's being painted in a lot of quarters, but that isn't Jesus. Jesus is terribly concerned about the honor of the Father. He's terribly concerned about truth. Not to the extent that love is ever gone. But you see, he's not ready to trade truth for love. And by the way, love without truth is sentimentality. It's Phil Donahue. It's not real love. Real love is grounded in the truth. You can check out 1 Corinthians 13. Real love does not rejoice in iniquity, but it rejoices in the truth. And so Jesus, our loving King and Savior, says, blind Pharisees, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, and the outside may be clean also. Now, again, there's a disparity between their inside and their outside, and hence the topic of this program. What does biblical purity look like versus ceremonial purity? Now, why this image, though? See, not only are the words of Scripture chosen, but the images that God uses are very deliberate. The Pharisees were deeply concerned about ceremonial purity and cleanliness. That was a major concern of theirs. They are focused very much on the ceremonial. And so this picture of differentiating between the external ceremonial purity and internal ceremonial purity is right where Jesus wants to hit them, because it's a major problem for them. So Sarah's back here. And Sarah's a little cut off here, but that's okay. Whoop. Sarah also jumped on me here. So I'm going to move Sarah over a little bit. Go back. There we go. And so Sarah's asking this question. She's back. She says, what does the law teach us about how purity was thought about? Now the reason I did this is very simple. Background is real important. And when we start talking about purity and what the law. Now remember, the Pharisees are very focused on the law. In fact, they're even putting a fence around the law to guard the law. And so we cannot discuss this passage in historical isolation. What did the law teach about purity? I mean, that's where the Pharisees would start, and then they would put a fence around that and create all sorts of other rules around that. But that would be ground level, and then you would have these additional rules to keep the original rules. So what are the rules? What is going on here? And what is the difference between ceremonial and inward spiritual purity? Now that's really a follow-up question that Sarah has, but they're both connected. What did the law teach? Will tell us a good deal about the difference and what its differences, the impact of that difference. And so there's Sarah. Now remember, she always has her obligatory cup of coffee. Yeah, it's kind of like live streaming, and I can't do the coffee, so I'm going to have Sarah do it for me. Let's talk about definitions. Everything turns on what things mean. In fact, I'd say that in apologetics, as well as life, the conversation, the terms have to be defined. Ceremonial impurity dealt with the outward physical purity necessary to be a full member of the covenant community and worship God. Let me unpack that for you. Okay? It dealt with physical purity, and that physical purity allowed you to function in the covenant community and to worship God. Remember that God's presence was there in the temple, prior to that in the tabernacle, and the key was, could you enter into drawing near to the presence of God and worship as part of the community? Remember, this is very, very communal. Now, inward purity is a different matter. Inward purity is purity of the heart, in which the character of God is reflected properly. See, when I'm inwardly pure, I am reflecting the character of God. Okay, I am consistent internally with the character of God, and that's what I'm reflecting. It's an inward thing, and it's tied to the character of God, but it is different than the outward ceremonial cleaning that was needed to function in the community. Now, how does God relate this concept of purity? We're going to talk about the relationship between ceremonial purity and inward purity. The main concepts that God uses over and over again are clean and unclean, which is related to the word kosher. Okay, unclean and clean. The kosher laws deal with this. This is a language used throughout Leviticus. This is the language that's foundational to these discussions. Let's look at the word unclean. Now I'm going to go just to my second monitor here for a second. There we go. And I'm not relating this. This is Edward Yamaguchi. He is talking about the word unclean in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. Very, very useful book. I've said it again and again. I often refer to it out of Moody Press. And so they're listed as articles under words. And so when you cite them according to the word or the heading. That's what you do with dictionaries, and that's what I've done. And there's Edward. Animals and foods were considered unclean and clean by nature. In other words, a pig didn't have to do anything to be unclean. It was simply unclean because it was a pig. It had the characteristics of an unclean animal, and so by nature it was unclean. Persons and objects could become unclean, so human beings were not born ritually unclean. Now let's be careful here. The scriptures indicate that they were born sinful, but they were not born ritually unclean. In other words, a baby could be presented for circumcision on the 8th day, and that was not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily given. There are ways, though, that people became unclean. When I've been teaching through Leviticus, I taught a lot through this whole section of these types of laws. We spent a lot of time there. Birth did render a child temporarily unclean. Why is that? Well, that's a whole other story. That's a study in itself. A woman's monthly was a admission, a discharge. This is not recommended for children because bodily emissions, okay? Girls and guys, guys have their things too, guy things. Leprosy, actually physical relations made one ritually unclean. That does not mean that proper relations in a marriage make one spiritually unclean. In fact, it's some of this language that Catholicism may have improperly understood. It is not as though God frowns upon the relations between a man and a woman. He designed it. Check out the book of Song of Songs. That book is highly visual. In fact, by rabbinical tradition, men were not allowed to read that book till about age 30. Misdeeds or contact with the dead rendered one unclean. Contact with the dead. And we, again, in my Leviticus study, I go through a little more of this. Priests and Levites had to be very concerned about this. But average Israelites did too. However, the uncleanness that is ritual is also associated with moral conduct or attitudes. Things. In other words, there's an extended meaning. Unclean is usually used in its physical sense, but it is sometimes used in its spiritual and moral sense. In fact, we're going to see that happens a whole lot. So what starts as purely ceremonial, we're going to talk about where it goes as far as clean and unclean physically. Okay. Now, the greatest uncleanness was idolatry. Now, you have to understand this. This is something that a lot of people don't get. But there is a relationship between the people, the land, and God. And what idolatry did was it defiled the temple or tabernacle, and it defiled the land while defiling the people. We don't have this sort of setup. But the Israelites were allowed to live on the land. And what they did as stewards of the land affected the land. This is one of the reasons for millennial temple sacrifices. See, I firmly believe in them because we have the same problem with ritual defilement during the millennial kingdom that we do for the Israelites. It's not exactly the same problem, but God literally dwelt in their midst in the tabernacle period and in the temple. And when Jesus returns in his glory, the full glory of God, the full essence of God in human form, in a glorified body, will again be present with human beings. And the issue of ritual uncleanliness comes to the forefront again. The prophets are very big on denouncing moral uncleanliness, using ritual uncleanliness as a metaphor. We're going to talk about this for wickedness, which God alone can cleanse. So there's an extended meaning. When God wants to teach them about the spiritual, God uses concretes. Now, you met my lovely daughter, Eliana, and she's going to learn abstract concepts through a concrete concept. It doesn't mean that we can't learn or understand abstract concepts, but we relate to abstract concepts through pictures that are connected to what we perceive. And we don't perceive the abstract visually and physically directly. See, I really can't hold up I can't hold up an infinity. See, I have an infinity here in my hand. I can't do that. So I understand the abstract concept of infinity through a related thing that I can more clearly observe. And so this is a very important teaching technique that God uses with Israel. God is, and I don't often use this metaphor, but God is, he's not just our cosmic parent, but he parents us perfectly. All right, he does do that. And so, like we're going to teach Eliana, she is going to learn and understand abstract concepts because she's made in the image of God, but she's going to relate them to things in the world that she can perceive more directly. And so God did that with Israel because that's the way you teach. Jesus did the same thing. Behold the birds of the air. Behold the lilies of the field. There's concretes. If God clothes these, like the heavy argument, how much more will he take care of you? He's pointing to concretes. And so the prophets are going to extend this. And there you go. Let's look at one case of that right now. Let me go back to that second monitor alone so you can see the verse real clearly. This is Isaiah 6:5 when Isaiah is getting his commission. I said, "Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips." There's that word. "And I dwell among a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Now, he had a theophany sort of experience. Actually, this is one of those cases in which we believe that we may be dealing with a theophany proper as opposed to a Christophany, but we're not sure. It could still very well have been what's called a Christophany, or an appearance of the second person. We know that Daniel, the Son of Man, approaches the Ancient of Days, and that is a case where we may actually have a pure theophany. But we won't go into that too deeply. Kyle and Delich comment on this. Okay, clearly Isaiah is not referring to physical uncleanliness. So this is Kyle and Delich's commentary in the Old Testament, very detailed. Volume 7. Okay, and they say the unholiness of his own person was doubled in consequence to the closeness of the natural connection by the unholiness of the nation to which he belonged. He designates this unholiness as uncleanness of lips. Notice that. Unholiness, which is a moral or spiritual thing, is being connected to uncleanness of lips. So uncleanness is not referring to the physical, but to the spiritual. Because he found himself transported into the midst of a choir of angels who were praising the Lord with pure lips. In other words, not with any sin, moral unholiness, moral uncleanness. And they call the king Jehovah, because although he's not seen Jehovah's face, he had seen the throne. Okay, so Kyle and Delich are saying this is a theophany proper, but he does not see God. He only sees the throne. And so that's their way of dealing with that. Okay, Isaiah again uses the same exact terminology. Depart from here. Touch no unclean thing. Go out from the midst of her. Be clean, you who bear the vessels of the Lord. Now, this is going to be used by Paul later on, and we're going to see how the New Testament uses this concept of uncleanness. Okay? And so there's the Hebrew word up there. It's about as large as I can make it with the vowel pointings. Tameh. And so that's your word. And so Isaiah's using it again. Now again, he's not referring to physical cleanliness. And so this has connections to the passage, but again, it's the same sort of usage. So Isaiah does this consistently, is my point here. Now, Jeremiah does likewise. So this is a phenomenon that you're going to see in the prophets. And just to kind of demonstrate that, Jeremiah is going to do the same thing. And the houses of Jerusalem and the houses of the kings of Judah shall be defiled like the place of Tophet. Okay, now Tophet is related to, or is connected to, this place of, judgment, this defiled place. Because all of the houses on whose roofs they burned incense to the host of heaven. That's paganism, idolatry. Notice that uncleanness is being tied to this sort of thing. And poured out drink offerings to other gods. We have the masculine use here, masculine plural. And so Jeremiah does likewise in his usage. Now, how does the New Testament does it? Does the New Testament focus on spiritual uncleanness or ritual uncleanness? Where's the focus in the New Testament? Let's go to Paul's writings in particular. Remember that Paul's background was being trained by the grandson of Hillel. I disagree strongly with Singer. It's ridiculous that he just made that up. You're standing in front of the Jewish Supreme Court and you make up credentials. They ought to know who was part of them and who wasn't. Me going on campus at Biola in front of the professors of the theology department who I sat under and then claimed to have a degree I don't have. From them. It's a ridiculous sort of thing. Paul was trained. Let's see how he uses this. Therefore, God gave them up to uncleanness, to the lusts of their heart, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. And by the way, the LGBT movement's going to hate this, but the Bible's very clear. I'm doing awful things to my own body and wrecking my soul. And by the way, I don't think God hates sin because he's just a killjoy. I think God hates sin because it damages the image of God in us, and it damages the image of God in those around us, and it has horrible consequences for our lives. It's as though God has to plead with people to save them from what they're doing to themselves. I'm sitting and I'm beating myself with a book, and God's telling me, don't do that, you're hurting yourself, and then I keep slapping his hand away. This passage clearly deals with sinfulness being demonstrated by three groups. Romans 1, 2, and 3 are a giant divine courtroom. There are three groups being looked at in there. Okay? You have the pagan, and what I mean by pagan is the out-and-out idolater who is not really attached to a solid moral code at all. Do I believe there are pagans in the U.S.? Yes. I don't believe pagans are non-Christians. There was one radio guy I really disliked. He kept doing that. He called everyone who called in who wasn't saved a heathen. I found that insulting and inaccurate. Okay, you have the out-and-out pagan. Now, does that mean that unsaved people aren't committing idolatry? They are, but they aren't necessarily attached to a paganistic worldview. As a complete paganistic worldview, in the sense of being attached to the mores of a fictitious deity that they regard as being the creator, sort of thing. It's a little different. We have the moralist. Now, that's the individual that believes in a strong right and wrong, but he does not have a personal attachment to God in any way, shape, or form. He may not even be a religious individual. I would call my dad a moralist in the sense that he's got a very strict code, and that code actually comes from a place that he doesn't want to acknowledge. We have the moralist. Then we have the Jew. Now, the Jew is the religious person. They had direct revelation of God. They were entrusted with the oracles of God. Romans chapter 3, 1 through 3. They were religious in every way. Their religion was not improper religion, but they indeed, and that whole thing is set up as a courtroom, and this section in 1 is dealing with the pagan, and uncleanness, remember, was connected with idolatry. So it's very fitting that Paul uses it right here. Let's not lose the context. Paul is looking at it in terms of inward purity and not ceremonial purity. Pagans didn't care about Jewish ceremonial purity laws. And so we know what this reference is to by the context and the flow of the text. Let's keep moving here. Romans 6:19. Paul maintains the same usage of uncleanness in terms of yielding our members to moral uncleanness as opposed to ceremonial uncleanness. I'm not going to take you through all of Romans 6:19. We're dealing with the issues of sanctification in 6 through 8. And Paul is talking about uncleanness and giving your members to uncleanness. He's not referring to giving your members to ceremonial uncleanness. He's talking about using your body in ways that are improper and sinful. And so he's talking about spiritual uncleanness. Now, there is a use in which Paul discusses ceremonial uncleanness. It's not the major use that Paul has, okay, but it is a use that Paul does occasionally use. Paul is talking about clean and unclean foods. Now, his whole point is going to be that the foods are not intrinsically unclean in the sense of having something that they did or something like that. They're unclean in terms of the kosher laws and the issue of food sacrificed to idols. And so we're dealing, this is like a key passage. I mean, every believer should go through Romans 14 understanding its background, because really it helps us with a lot of issues today. And it deals with those things in which there is no clear command, but there is an issue of discerning principle with, and how do we deal with these things. And the issue around 14 was that you had Jewish believers and Gentile believers in the Roman church. And of course, the Jewish believers continued to live as Jews. They continued to live as Israelites, because there weren't any other Israelites that weren't Jews. And so he's commenting on the kosher laws. The Gentiles were not bound to those laws. Now, in that day, beyond simply the kosherness of the meat in terms of the animal it came from, because Romans did pig, there was also the fact that meat would be discounted after it was offered to Zeus. You know, he might have been trying to watch his weight or something, I don't know. But there was meat that was offered to idols, and of course, you know, I'm sure that the temple priests and stuff got into things, but there was discounted meat. It was on the discounted meat counter. And so occasionally believers felt, since there is no Zeus, we don't worship Zeus, but this meat's like 50% off, I'm going to go ahead and buy it. Well, a Jew would never eat meat that was sacrificed to idols. Now remember, idolatry was a problem in Israel. Synchronism was. They went to Babylon. They got pretty strongly cured of that particular sin. And so they were very sensitive to these issues. And so this produced a problem. The Gentiles being free in conscience, the Jews not. And so Paul gives direction here. Now I'm going to take you all the way through Romans 14, even though I feel it's very important. But Paul says that I know and am convinced, let me pull that up where you can see it a little better, by the Lord Jesus, that nothing is unclean of itself. But to him who considers it unclean, it is to him it is unclean. Now Paul's saying here, if you have a conscience issue here around things which are ceremonially unclean, then don't do it. I choose not to imbibe alcohol. I don't tell other believers that they can never ever imbibe alcohol. And I watch cooking shows where they occasionally use it and burn off the alcohol for cooking, and I don't even do that. Could I do that? Yeah, I could create beef burgundy. My wife would like beef burgundy. The alcohol gets burned off. I just don't have it around, because maybe the burgundy wouldn't find itself to the beef. It might find itself to someone else. Does that mean that I couldn't? No, it means I don't. I just don't. Now, that's not moral uncleanness. Paul isn't saying, you know, if someone considers murder unclean, let it be unclean to him. What we're talking about here what I'm talking about here is simply that this is a use where ceremonial unclean really occurs. And Paul is really talking about ceremonial uncleanness. And so we want to be clear that yes, there are places where it's used in terms of ceremonial uncleanness. So what does this tell us? What can we draw from this? Well, there's some mention of the ceremonial uncleanness due to the need for fellowship between Jewish believers, which continued to follow Jewish practices, and Gentile believers, which were free from the restrictions through the decision of the Jerusalem Council by the Spirit of God. If you want to understand how this worked, Paul would never have needed to write Romans 14 if Gentile believers were still under the law. Get this through your head, black Hebrew Israelites. It's that simple. Now, they have a lot of problems, but they have this problem. Get this through your head, extreme one law movement people. It's where I did my dissertation. Get it through your head. Gentiles are not obligated to keep Jewish ceremonial laws. End of story. Done. Jewish people were allowed to remain ethnically, culturally practicing Jews. God didn't have a problem with the culture that he molded for them. But it becomes an issue, and so some mentions of uncleanness are references to ceremonial uncleanness. It does happen. But it's not the major place. It's not the major place where people are. there begins to be a much, much greater emphasis on spiritual uncleanness, and there's less and less of a mention of ceremonial uncleanness because the emphasis is just focused on the spiritual. But beyond that, there's something else involved here. The ceremonial purity was only a foreshadow of a spiritual purity yet to come. Now, let me make this verse bigger because it's a big section out of Hebrews. Remember the audience that this is written to. This is written to a Hebrew audience. This is written to Jewish believers. Now, when these things had been prepared, the priests always went into the first part of the tabernacle, performing the services, but not into the second part. The high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, and he offered for himself and the people's sins committed in ignorance, the Holy Spirit indicating that the way to the holiest of all, or the Holy of Holies, had not yet been manifest while the first tabernacle still was standing, or was still standing. Notice, it was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to conscience, concerned only with food. What were those offerings concerned with? Foods and drinks, various washings and earthly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. And so the writer of Hebrews is making a connection between the ceremonial purity as a foreshadow of spiritual purity in relation to the present time. I'm going to go ahead and move forward here. Various washings is not accidental in Hebrews. Remember that Hebrews is referring back to the Torah and to the sacrificial system. Numbers 19, 7, and 8 are dealing with this idea of various washings. Then the priest shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and afterward he shall come into the camp. The priest shall be unclean ceremonially until evening, and the one who burns it, this is referring to the red heifer, shall wash his clothes in water, bathe in water, and shall be unclean ceremonially until evening. Okay? So the Hebrews reference to washings there is a reference to ceremonial cleanness and the washings that were required related to the tabernacle. In fact, the word temporary is the word parabole, which is the word we get parable from. So if I'm reading this section, those washings and ordinances connected to the temple and tabernacle were a parable of what was going to come in terms of the new covenant and Messiah. Parabole, which comes from the idea of placing two things para alongside each other to be understood. So a parable is a simile. If it's not a simile, if it's not a metaphor, it's not a parable. If it's not placing two things this like that, or a comparison of two things to underlie a spiritual truth as to how, in terms of connection between those things, how they relate, it's not a parable. Side note, Luke 16 is not a parable. There was a certain man. This event did happen. The Jews don't take it as a parable. Jesus never calls it a parable. Jesus doesn't use the language of parable, so I have no reason to believe it's a parable. That's just a little side note on the word parabole. But this indicates the washings and ceremonial cleanliness and ceremonial purity was a parabole of the things that were to come. And that they foreshadowed the moral cleanliness and spiritual cleanliness that God was going to make available fully in the new covenant. Praise God. This is such exciting stuff. Until when? It was temporary. Until the time of Reformation. Does that mean Martin Luther and Calvin? What are we talking about? I hear Christians call themselves Reformed Christians. It must be that in terms of Hebrews and the time of Reformation. No, it's not. And that would be a horrible misinterpretation of the passage. But people do those sorts of things in these cults. They pull a word out and they make it has nothing to do with what it's about. And so Guthrie, in his commentary on Hebrews, Introduction and Commentary, volume 15 of the New Testament commentaries, makes some comment. Okay, speaking of these washings and ceremonial stuff, beneficial to the body, but they did not bring liberty to the spirit. They were also only temporary until the time of Reformation. And there's the Greek word transliterated for you by Donald Guthrie. The unusual expression does not occur anywhere else in the Greek Bible. That would be the New Testament, by the way, but is a kin expression to like regeneration in Matthew 29:28. So Guthrie is saying these two expressions are, saying basically the same thing. They're just two different expressions. All right. And so I thought, well, then I need to go to Matthew 19:28 and look at the word that's a similar expression. Now, if Guthrie's analysis is correct, the same sort of phrase or idea is being used here as in Hebrews. And so let's see what's going on in Matthew 19:28. So Jesus said, assuredly I say to you that in the regeneration, see, there's that word that relates to that time of Reformation, not Martin Luther, but regeneration, Reformation, they're similar expressions. When the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed, okay, now he's referring to the 12, okay, the apostles, will also sit on 12 tribes, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. When is this regeneration? Well, if Guthrie's right, and the expression Reformation contains the exact same idea as the regeneration, when's the regeneration? It refers to the millennial kingdom. Now, I know there's a different audience out there. I'm gonna state the theology. I'm gonna, I tell you, where I'm going, and then you can decide to take the ride. But clearly in this passage, I see this referring to the millennial kingdom. I do not see this referring to the church. Well, I don't see it referring to the church. Well, the 12 tribes of Israel are the church. Let's see. Who's Dan? Is he like the Presbyterians or the Lutherans? Is he a Baptist, a Southern Baptist, an American Baptist? And which group is he representative of? The context here is a Jewish audience. He's talking to Jewish apostles. They would have regarded the 12 tribes of Israel as being Israel. They would have regarded them sitting in judgment over Israel as being given some sort of oversight or supervision over real tribes of real Jews. Okay. And so I do not buy that this is the church. There's no millennial kingdom. There's no restoration of Israel. I'm sorry. That's really, really, that kind of gets my little theological blood boiling. I do understand there are dear brothers and sisters who have not come to that opinion yet. But I really, worry about replacement theology. What is the point in this section? Ceremonial purity is only a temporary picture of a greater reality, which is spiritual purity. And that's what it was designed to do. And that was what it was designed to be. And so, moving right along, and we are, what is Jesus's point to these Pharisees? What's the big deal about washing the cup? What is the issue going on here? Their overemphasis on the ceremonial parts of the law and ceremonial purity was at the expense of genuine inward spiritual purity. And it misuses the law, and it is an offense to God. Now, lest you think this has no relationship at all to believers, I have seen believers obsess over playing cards. Now, there's a place to discuss this in terms of Romans 14, but as far as finding a direct correlation between the Bible and not allowing the game of Uno or face cards, that is ridiculous. And so there are these things that we just need to understand, that they may picture and may go back to a principle, but they are not a command, and they are not necessarily something I can impose on every brother and sister that I run around trying to be an imposition on. And I saw a lot of this. I saw one gentleman who was Reformed and thought Sunday was the Christian Sabbath. Well, Sunday can, I worship, I have no problem with Sunday worship. It's the Lord's Day, and believers worshiped on the Lord's Day. But God didn't change the calendar. God celebrated or had believers celebrating, or permitted believers or celebrating, providentially had believers celebrating. I don't care what language. Believers were celebrating the resurrection, not the creation. And so that's a whole other story. But I mean, he got really crazy. The girls had to sit. They couldn't play. It really got nuts. And that's on misuse. Romans 14, have your convictions. But don't go crazy like the Pharisees over ceremonial uncleanness. Outward rules. Don't build a fence around the law. Now, is this where he stops? No, and we're not going to get too far into this other section, but I felt that we should. He's going to continue to warn the Pharisees, 28 through 36, about the end result of this great divide between their outward show of purity in their inner heart condition. While we're not going to get completely through this section, there's some important issues, particularly around 35 of 23, and we're going to have to spend more time on them because they're going to deal with that judgment and things. We'll begin this section. Actually, Matthew 23:35 ends the section and begins Jesus' lament over Israel. There's judgment coming. Jesus laments that judgment. So let's look at this section. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly. Notice the outward is good. I mean, these guys look like, really, really righteous dudes. But inside are full of dead man's bones and uncleanness. Now, Jesus is using ceremonial uncleanness to picture moral uncleanness here. All right? The dead, touching the dead made one ritually defiled. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men. Boy, you look good. You are squeaky clean in the way you look. But inside you are full of hypocrisy. And look at this lawlessness. I thought these were the guys who kept the law. These were the guys who kept Torah. I love this because I can honestly say to certain Jewish polemicists, you go about thinking that you are so lawful, but you are really lawless. Now, let's take away something from this. The gap between the inward and outward, if it becomes too large, can lead to the fall of a man or woman. Do you want to know how believers fall in ministry and fail in ministry? This is it. And it's not a quick thing. All right. There has been a big brouhaha. I know it's dying down. And I usually talk about things after they're dying down because they're so heated that no one's like thinking straight. Everybody, is just going off everywhere. And I saw like a week of this and it drove me nuts. Everybody was discussing, how did Rabbi Zacharias go wrong? What are the keys? And I know that maybe some people were saying, I want to avoid that sort of fate. So I'm going to find the exact formula that keeps me from ever falling into sin. Okay? But I found some of it really tasteless and offensive. I really did. Sitting there speculating about how this man fell publicly without regards to the feelings of the Zacharias family by every would-be and even legitimate apologist and theologian really is not the way to go. But now that people have at least started to slow their breathing down and their heart rate has come down below 150 beats per second here, we can begin to at least say something. Let me say a few words. Okay? that are useful principles. I don't know exactly what exact situations occurred. I don't even want to read about all the details of this. I don't want the gory details. I don't. Be careful if you say you stand, lest you fall, the scriptures say. I don't want to know every detail. I don't need to know every detail. A man or woman's fall is never all at once. Let me say that again. A man or woman's fall in terms of their walk is never all at once. It's a slow slide. And so we end up putting people on a pedestal, and then we see this tumble, but this tumble was in the works. If you want to avoid falling, don't slide. And so that's the first thing we need to learn. By the way, that may make it into the Apolobites, which is a new thing I've added to Patreon. And they're the refrigerator magnets sayings plus a paragraph of commentary. Okay? It's a slow side. Accountability to a local body of believers is safety for any man or woman ministering the gospel. And it should be in place. If you have a ministry, if you are involved with a ministry, you need to be tethered to a local body. Find a good one, but find one. Lone Ranger is a good way to get shot. You know, it is a key trick of lions and predators to separate out the herd. The cheetah, the lion, the hyena, they spot the weak. They separate the weak from the rest of the herd and they kill it. And Satan does the same thing. Get connected. Stay connected. Stay. I have seen believers play musical. I'm not saying never leave a church. But I've seen believers that do a merry-go-round thing. Usually they end up being very unstable. Find a place. This is a shot at mission boards and churches. I have been in hotel rooms alone between speaking engagements. I do not do the paid channels because the paid channels often have things that I shouldn't pay to see, and I don't do them. If I have to bring some movies on my computer, I bring movies on my computer if there's downtime. If there's nothing that I can do, I have to be a little careful. I probably could even tighten that up. But here's what I'd say to mission boards and churches. Support a missionary speaker bringing his wife. Do you want to know what helps a guy in a hotel room? If the missus is there, okay, that's real helpful. It removes temptation. It provides safety for the man. And provides his wife to be a ministry partner. And mine is terribly valued to me. Chosen people didn't encourage that in the past. They've been a little more encouraging of that. I would encourage that to the hilt. It's not good for the man to be alone. And it's real useful to have the wife there. Now, it's more expensive. Churches, Cephas was allowed to bring his wife, and he was an apostle. Yeah, it's more expensive, but it's safety. You don't want to set that man up. You don't want to set the ministry up. You don't want to set the name of the Lord Jesus up. Figure out a way, but this really sets the man up for temptation, and it separates him from his God-given ministry partner. Not a good plan. And my wife likes traveling, so I don't have to push the point. If I say to her, you're allowed to come, she comes. All right. Again, you're going to see these. They may make it to Apolobites. I don't think I'm being redundant. I think I'm making much of the material God has given me. The heart of the matter is the matter of the heart. That's what it comes down to all the time. You can do a thing all you want with the externals, and you can be externally polished. And by the way, guys who fall continue to be very polished. And it's not a comment on Robbie. That's a comment on anybody. I've seen men go weird places, and they don't lose their polish. Pay attention. Not that any man has to be perfect, but if there are major issues in his life, it may be time for him to focus a little more on inward purity. And so the Pharisees got it wrong. They focused on the outside of the cup and left the inward side of the cup alone. And it's a real problem. And so the solution is not to go ahead and stab afterwards the wounded bodies of those around the individual, speculating on how you can be pure. Avoid temptation, stay close to God, and do what he told you. And there's no magic formula that's going to keep you from the potential of sin. That potential is there. Guard your heart. That will guard the rest. And remember to try and pay attention to how wide you want the gap to get. There's always going to be a difference. But if that difference is continually growing and growing and growing, and it's really trashing your energy, your connection to the battery, your connection to God, who is your everything, then you're running the risk of trying to run the ministry on empty alone, and temptation will find you. So, well, that's about our hour. I do miss having you guys here. I do miss the interaction, but you saw the really, really wonderful, cute, adorable granddaughter I have, and so we are enjoying her. Again, I will be continuing to broadcast either premieres or recorded stuff. We will get back together. Don't leave the channel if you're just viewing this. This is not everyday life. This is a part of what I do, but we will get back to the live streaming. And so, see you soon, and actually in person in a little bit. God bless, and good night.